Thank you all for coming out tonight. I know that the weather's kind of nasty and it would have been much nicer to stay in bed, but I'm glad you came. I have a lot of things to talk about, and that was a really nice introduction. Thank you. I think it's more about the topic than what I have to say that brings people out and makes it popular, but hopefully through kind of talking about it tonight, we can find some ways to make time out more effective for you. I'm a psychologist of behavioral health. I've been doing this here for a couple of years and trained all over the place. And typically what parents are most interested in is I've got 4 kids at home. And so I do this all day long at the office, and then I go home and do it until they go to bed at night. So lots and lots of practice with time out. And so both kind of research-based things we'll talk about as well as kind of practical things. So that being said, let's see. So this is what I'd like to do tonight. I usually do this really informally, and so it's largely driven by what you want to talk about. And it's especially nice with such a small group, so hopefully everybody's going to be able to go home with some really personalized information and get all of your questions answered. So we'll talk a little bit about your goals. I'll talk a little bit broadly about discipline and then get really focused on timeout and techniques and kind of what works. The place I always like to start is questions, so that way I know that whatever you came for, you got before you leave. So if I wait for questions at the end, sometimes I talk for so long or we get distracted. So why is everybody here? Anybody tried timeout before? How'd it work?
For me, great.
Worked great for you?
Yeah.
Okay.
I left and went and stood in the corner and was in a much better mood.
A mini retreat, huh? Here live, we saw a lot of thumbs down about timeout, so not working. So what went wrong?
Won't stay seated.
Won't stay seated, okay.
I'm in a weird situation. I have identical twins, and I have one that's timeout is very effective. He doesn't want to be in timeout, so therefore the behavior stops. The other one laughs in my face.
So not identical in that way. Okay. So differences among the kids, so kind of laughing in your face or resistance.
When is it appropriate to start? I have an almost 18-month-old and an almost 3-year-old.
So when to start, we'll definitely talk about that. We'll talk about resistance. The first one was getting out of timeout. What else? There was a big thumbs down in the back.
How to go about, just how to do a timeout. It's
Okay.
At what point during the behavior do you put them in timeout? What do you say? How do you address it afterwards?
Okay, so kind of the nuts and bolts.
Yeah.
We'll definitely talk about that too.
Maybe like the proper setting for a timeout, space or area.
Okay. So space. Other things you want to definitely go home with?
My daughter's like 18 months, and I've been kind of like practicing because we're gonna start incorporating this soon. So like, I don't know, like how to introduce it, because when they're young, they don't. If you just pop them in a chair and say, "Here's your timeout," they don't really quite understand what's going on.
Sure. We'll definitely talk about that too. And what you bring up is a really interesting developmental kind of issue too, because what tends to get kids into timeout works for. I see a baby in the back. At that age, you yell and scream and swing your arms and you get what you want, right? And so when they get to kind of the age that you're talking about is when we want to start transitioning away from that they start using kind of other skills or tools to get what they want. I started talking and I saw another hand.
What about the kids who put themselves in timeout?
Okay.
My son will perform a behavior that he knows is not acceptable, and then when I catch him doing it, he says, "Oh, naughty," and goes and sits in timeout. So I don't think it's that much of a deterrent.
Okay. Not that big of a problem. Or not, it doesn't seem like it causes, maybe you want to see a little bit more distress in their response to timeout. Okay. These sound like great places to start. Any other kind of questions or concerns you want to make sure I hit on? Yes.
From our chat, a parent would like to know about a little using timeout in public, discipline in public.
I'm glad whoever out there asked that, because I definitely want to talk about using timeout in public. So I'll add that. Okay. This is a great list, and please interrupt me or throw your hands up as we go if something doesn't make sense or you want me to talk more about it. I probably run through this 8 or 9 times a day between what I do at work and what I do at home. So there's lots to talk about. So before we even get into the nuts and bolts of timeout, I want to talk a little bit about ways to make consequences, more broadly speaking, more effective. Excuse me, and I have to apologize too. I'm a little bit under the weather, so I'm going to be really careful not to cough into the microphone at you. Timeout works best when it's part of a broader system of behavior management. And so if the only thing that you've got in your toolbox is timeout, you're going to run into problems. And if you're using timeout for everything that comes up, you're going to run into problems because it's going to lose its effectiveness. You're going to get worn out. Child's going to get worn out. It's not going to sort of generalize as well as you'd like it to. So you want to make sure that it's part of a larger kind of parenting approach. And I see a lot of partnered folks in here, and you want to make sure it's kind of consistent across partners, but also consistent across context. So you want to make sure that if certain things are being done at school, they're being done at home as well. And timeout is not a silver bullet. I mean, this isn't going to solve all your problems. And for a lot of kids, we've even heard about some of those tonight already, that they have kind of sophisticated responses to timeout. I was looking a little bit online and at some other resources that talked about timeout. You know, the textbook, you use it and the behavior that's a problem goes away quickly, and that's how you know timeout's effective, is that you use it and you no longer see biting or hitting or screaming or throwing things. But that's not always what happens, right? And that's why a lot of parents come here, is they want to get a little bit more information. It's helpful sometimes to think about timeout as just a more intensive attention management approach, or part of a broader system of positive reinforcement. Because what happens in timeout is you're withholding positive reinforcement in every kind of way. And if you're doing a good job managing the attention your child gets, and so really, really excited and positive and engaged when he or she is doing what they're supposed to do, when timeout's applied, it creates a much sharper contrast. And so you feel it in a really, really different kind of way. And so you want to be very careful about that and be aware of kind of how timeout fits into everything else that you're doing. So when we're talking about the 3 primary ways to make consequences more effective, you want it to be as immediate as possible. And so basically what this means is you want to have the consequence occur as close as possible in time and space to the behavior you're trying to correct. And so the question about how to do timeout in public is really valuable, because you don't want to be, at the zoo or the children's museum or the grocery store, and a problem happens, and then you wait, 30 minutes to get home and put all the groceries away, and then try to do a timeout for what happened out in public, because it's not going to have any effect whatsoever, especially when we're talking about these younger kids. A 2-year-old, you're lucky if they remember what happened 5 minutes ago and kind of arrange that. And so, especially with young kids, you want to make it as close as possible in time and space. But focusing on the immediacy is really going to help. You want to be as consistent as possible, and so I talked a little bit about this as far as consistent across caregivers. And so the same behavior that earns a timeout at mom's house earns a timeout at dad's house, earns a timeout at grandma's house. And so the message is repeated again and again and again, that when I behave in this way, I'm going to be getting a consequence for it. And it's also really important, thinking to all the families that I see in clinic, sometimes parents want to give leeway in different kinds of situations. I think about families who are experiencing a lot of stress. It might be harder to give that time out. Or I work with a lot of families who also see our psychiatrist, and there might be medication issues, and parents want to back off on expectations and consequences during those periods. I really recommend against that, because it can be really disorienting for a child. That what kids need is to see you as this really sort of strong, consistent figure in their life. And so that provides a lot of grounding and provides the seeds for attachment. And so it allows the child to believe that what I have in this parent is strong and secure and it's going to be there no matter what. That's not to say you have to be, rigid and there's never any bending or flexing in the rules, but keeping in mind that the more consistent you are, the more regular, the more routine you are, the easier it is going to be for your child, both in terms of learning the timeout, but also looking to you as, for guidance and support and all those kinds of things, that you're going to make their lives as consistent and comfortable and secure as possible. And that's both in terms of they can always come to you for nurturing, but also for consistency in terms of these consequences. I have a lot of kids who are kind of going through divorce as well, and inevitably there's this tension that's created between separated parents that they don't want to be the bad guy. Not all the time, but it can happen that you don't want to be the bad guy. You want to have a good time when the child is with you. That is really disorienting for a child and really undermines successful behavior management. And so you want to be as consistent across caregivers as possible. And contexts and time, all of those kinds of things. Contingency is a really, really important one, and one that often gets missed. This essentially means you do the crime, you do the time, that there aren't second chances and ultimatums and explanations and warnings. Those sorts of things, that the expectation is set, you hit your sister, you go to timeout. When kids hear, don't do that again, or this is your last chance, if that happens again, you're going to timeout, what they learn is they can get away with it at least once. And inevitably, in families, you lose track. Like, did I already tell them they couldn't do that, or was that yesterday? And so you have all of this misbehavior that occurs, and it doesn't have a consequence, and it creates this really inconsistent picture for the child, like, when can I get away with this and when can't I? Is this going to be one of those chances I can get away with it? And this isn't a cognitive conscious process the child goes through, but they don't know. Hitting my sister might pay off this time, I might get the toy, or I might go to timeout. I got to hit my sister every time because this might be one of the times I get what I want. And so you want to make this is kind of bringing together consistent and contingent, but when you see the problem, it needs the consequence. Yes?
How do you tell the child that first time how do you let them know what the expectations are, I guess? Without the, if you do this, then this will happen.
You can, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, you want to separate as much as possible a kind of compliance situation or a disciplinary situation from an instructional situation. And so you can express your expectations or teach lessons all the time. So you could talk about why the sky is blue, you could talk about how electricity runs through buildings, that kind of thing, but you don't want to have a long conversation about electricity and conduction when they're like racing at the outlet, right? And so you can talk about expectations all the time. We keep our hands to ourselves. When mom tells you to do something, you do it right away, right? And so you can have the conversation, and we'll talk a little bit to your question about setting up timeout, but teaching it ahead of time, that this is the procedure for timeout, these are the reasons why you'll go to timeout, and it's also really, really, really instructive to experience timeout. And so even if you think they're a little bit hazy about, if I hit my sister, what's going to happen? They go to timeout after it happens. We're starting to pair this behavior with this consequence, right? And then it happens again, and it happens again. Okay, I can't hit my sister. I can't bite anybody. I can't run away when mom tells me to do something, right? Excuse me. So, but you're right, that's a really good question, because you want to set up as much as you can ahead of time what the expectations are, and there'll be times where you never anticipated that they would be sticking this or that in the fan. And so I guess we didn't talk about that. What should I do? You can just have categories. You were doing something dangerous, now you have a timeout. And so they can learn that lesson in that place too. But that was a great question. So as much as possible, and you want to pull out the explanations. In these situations too, you don't want to have a long conversation, and I'll talk about this in terms of the nuts and bolts of timeout, about why you're going into timeout. And that's what I was talking about with the outlet, like why it's bad to hit your sister, why you need to listen the first time, why it's going to be hard to make friends at school if you're hitting, and so you don't want to hit. This is how you make friends. Totally irrelevant when you're having, when the child is misbehaving and you need to apply the consequence. And so, because ultimately in that moment, if you look at what happens immediately afterwards, is I have a long conversation with mom or dad, that's not so bad, right? And so you don't want to have that long conversation. You want to get the timeout as close as possible to the misbehavior, or really whatever consequence you're applying. And so as kids get older and you're phasing out timeout, it might be, you lose privileges or you get extra chores, that kind of thing. I alluded to this a little bit earlier. Timeout only works if it's a contrast. And so having a rich, positive, engaging environment for your child is really, really important, because if timeout happens and nothing's really going on anyway, or mom and dad or grandma or aunt or foster parent are really distant, then timeout isn't much of a contrast, right? And this isn't to say that they need, really expensive toys you've got to spend every day at the Children's Museum in order for timeout to work, but availability and interest and attention, praise, catching your child being good often, and catching especially those the opposites of misbehavior are going to be really, really effective too. And this gets back to the beginning. We were talking a little bit about how you need to set this up as a contrast and make it part of a whole kind of spread or system of behavior management, that you are working really, really hard, even with your 18-month-old. I'm really excited when you ask for what you want instead of yelling and screaming. You get really, really excited when you say no and they kind of go on with their day, right? That they're not kicking and screaming and yelling on the floor. That even recognizing those small behaviors can do a whole lot for creating that contrast to make timeout work better. So, not so much a procedure, but a state of mind. This is probably one of the most important messages that I want to send home with you, that a lot of folks, a lot of parents get lost in kind of the location, and do I say the right thing, and is it the right number of minutes that they're in timeout? Those things can be really important, but they're less important than this. What you're doing is you're creating a situation that they're not getting any positive reinforcement. And so it doesn't have to happen in a particular room or in the corner. When families get really good at this, they can do them anywhere, anytime. I mean, they can be riding in the car somewhere and say, you're in timeout. That means mom and dad aren't talking to you during this period, that the radio is off, that, whatever, that you're not playing with any toys while this timeout is going on. And you might get some yelling and screaming in the car seat, but it's very clear that you did, you threw your toy at the window, you lose your toys, and you're in timeout for this period of time. And when you get good at this, when you get good at creating this sort of state of mind, both with you, and that was a great analogy too, like that you need your own timeout, but it's a state of mind kind of in both the parent and the child, that this is how I'm going into this. It's a really, really specific behavior management intervention that I'm using, and so I'm not going in angry, that this is, something I do to change behavior, just like the child is in the situation where they are not getting any positive reinforcement whatsoever. When to use, it really depends on the family. All families have different rules and expectations. Some of the sort of problem-focused ways that I talk about applying this is anytime there's aggression, anytime there is property destruction, like willfully, intentionally breaking toys, or throwing stuff at the windows, that sort of thing. As kids get older, repeated noncompliance. I told you once, I told you twice, you're not following directions, you need to go to timeout. Breaking established rules, and so that's why it's important to be pretty explicit with kids about what the expectations are. So this is how we sit at the dinner table. This is how I expect you to help your siblings when they ask, those kinds of things. So kids know what they're doing and know when the consequences are coming. As far as the logistics go, the how is as boring as you possibly can be. That going into this with any kind of sort of anger, agitation, or sort of harshness is only potentially going to be reinforcing, because it gives more attention and energy to the situation. And what you're trying to do is suck all of the reinforcing aspects out of the situation. And so something as simple, this is how I recommend setting it up. There's no fill in the blank. Now you have timeout. And once you're ready to go live with this, the child should know exactly what that means. The location, the duration, all of that. So it's ready to go. Child goes to the timeout space. Time passes. The time actually starts when the child's quiet, so they're not yelling and screaming for the entirety of the timeout. At the end, timeout's over. You're in timeout for fill in the blank, and then blank slate. We're ready to go on with our day, and as much as possible, letting go of whatever kind of was agitating to you, and the behavior itself, that they've done the crime, they've done the time, we're ready to move on with our days. No other explanation is necessary. No other lecture. No other, don't do that again, otherwise you're going to end up in timeout. What you can do at that point is be really careful about catching them doing something positive after timeout, getting really excited when they re-engage with their toys, or they go over and play with siblings, or they respond to you when you tell them to do something, so they comply when you tell them to do that. Yes?
When you're first starting it, how do they know if they've done something wrong if you're not explaining to them afterwards? Say the first time we start establishing, because we've got a hitter, the first time, is it helpful to say afterwards, we don't hit, we don't hit. That's why you went to timeout.
Excuse me. The best time to have that conversation is nowhere near the actual timeout. So I want to make sure that this gets to the folks at home, but the question was, how do you establish the expectations if you're not talking about them around timeout? Any other time is when you want to have that conversation. And so you're sitting at the dinner table, everybody's got their hands to themselves. You're doing a great job keeping your hands to yourself. When you don't keep your hands to yourself, that's when you go to timeout. Or it might be when you're establishing the timeout procedure, and so this is where we do timeout, this is how long you stay in timeout, and these are the reasons you'll get into timeout, is when you do this, this, or this. And if we're talking about an 18-month-old, being really language heavy is not going to get anything done, right? And so in those situations, it's going to be much more the experience of timeout. So the 18-month-old takes a swing at somebody, and they go to timeout. And at that age, you get 10 seconds, you're doing great in terms of the timeout. So the next one, location. This doesn't make any difference. In some situations, you want them to be isolated. And so it could be a timeout room, it could be a timeout chair, it could be in a corner, it could be on the floor, it could be on the bottom of the steps. For kids who just everything you try, they won't stay in timeout and they're too big to kind of hold safely in that space, you can do it in a room. That can be a room like a guest bedroom, or it could be a bathroom. If you've got the space to do that, as long as they're not going to get into any chemicals or anything dangerous. And so it can happen in all kinds of different spaces. And to be honest, some of the most effective timeouts are the ones where you're actually in the room, because you're able to communicate really powerfully and effectively. There's nothing that you can do to get my attention right now other than to serve your timeout, and then I let you out. And so showing them in a really powerful way, mom is off for timeout, or dad is off for this timeout. And you'll get all kinds of responses. And I'm sure kind of what you have seen among your own kids, you get all kinds of things between runners. I have, may actually do it right now if I can find it. I I ran a timeout with my 3-year-old, and it was really wonderful because she gave us all kinds of what I hope are familiar things. So this is, the reason I wanted to show this is, first of all, because it happens at everyone's home, and also because I think that there's some really valuable data in here that we can kind of problem solve and talk about. I recorded it on my phone, and so if this doesn't make any sense, like shake your head at me or something, but I wanted to bring in some like real live data of this happening. So this is my 3-year-old in timeout a couple of days ago. She changes a tactic in here in just a second.
Daddy.
And so that goes on for a while. What I really like about that is you see how kind of clever it is that I have a tack that should work. When I say nobody loves me, somebody should be running to my aid and saying that's not true. She knows it's not true. But she says it when she's in timeout because I don't like this, I want to engage you, and there are plenty of opportunities when she's not in timeout for her to understand that plenty of people love her. And so in there, it's really intentional. And you also see how all kids will do this. This tactic isn't working, and so I got to switch it. I want out, so I'm deciding I'm done. And she stayed in timeout until I stopped hearing her because she doesn't decide when she's done with timeout. This isn't, she decides when she goes in and she decides when she comes out. That's not how consequences need to work. That she is experiencing this consequence as a result of her behavior, and you as parents decide when that timeout is over. Yes. And she is 3 and was really agitated going into the timeout. And so I was looking for about 15 to 20 seconds. Like I was waiting for her to be quiet so I could catch her and say, you were in timeout for whatever it was she did. And then it was done with.
So like I've read and I've heard another doctor say one time that like according to their age, so if they're 3 years old, that'd be like 3 minutes in timeout. Is that protocol or not really?
That's why I like to talk about flexibility on some of these details. If you've got a 6-year-old with ADHD and who's really excitable, if you're waiting for 6 minutes of, quiet sitting, they can't do that all day at school, let alone like when they're in trouble, right? And so nobody knows their kid better than you know your kid. And so looking at this in such a way that you're seeing the timeout have an effect. I put up here a minute for every year of age because sometimes it's nice to have grounding or some kind of guideline, but this isn't sort of set in stone, that you can be really, really flexible. And waiting for your 18-month-old to sit there for 90 seconds, that's a tall order. Like some can do it, but most can't. And so at that point, you're just fine if you're getting, again, I'm sorry? Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And you also know by the situation that if they're yelling and screaming in timeout for 40 minutes, and regardless of how old they are, if you get 30 seconds of kind of quiet calm, that's a great time to release them from timeout, not only because everybody's exhausted at that point, but you've also shown that this is a situation that you go into contingent on whatever behavior got you there in the first place. And in the future, when you want to get out of timeout, all you got to do is that quiet, calm. And so they can start having the opportunity to practice, okay, I need to get quiet and calm. And then they get out of the timeout. Yes?
So is it possible that, like, you know, starting timeouts with my 21-month-old, that a timeout could take like 10, 15 minutes at first?
Yes.
Okay.
It's awful. Yeah, it's really awful. And I wish, a few years ago I was working with a client who was just ready to go to town on this and really, really serious, went live with her timeouts and had this wonderful sort of linear data of the first time she did timeout with her maybe 4-year-old, took 45 minutes to get 3 minutes of quiet. But every timeout after that took progressively less until timeout was about 3.5, 4 minutes. Like there was a little sniffling and whining at the beginning, but calm came pretty quickly. So stick to it, because one of the other things that you want to make sure is that the child learns that my getting out of timeout is contingent on me doing the expectations of timeout, not based on me getting up, me being so sad. This creates a really difficult situation for some families, because kids might discover that if I say I need to go to the bathroom, then timeout is suddenly over. I want to talk about a little bit of flexibility with this. If you're a really, really hardcore timeout enthusiast, that might not matter. That you're perfectly happy to clean up whatever results. And that's actually how I run timeout at home. And I've never had an accident to clean up. I've got, you know, every child is different, and so yours might be one that needs that break. If you decide to allow a break for going to the bathroom in timeout, timeout starts over as soon as you come out. That any time that's accrued is gone. Okay? So it builds in a little bit of a cost to going to timeout, or going to the bathroom during timeout. But really, really important, I talk to families about this all the time, that they put their child in timeout and lose track of, and then all of a sudden they're all back together 30 minutes later. And the parent has no idea when the child got out of timeout. And so you put the child in, take the child out. And that's why I also recommend a timer, is because it kind of keeps everybody honest and allows you to track things. For some parents, hearing the child in timeout is so aversive that I'm doing something terrible to my child and making them cry. And so the timeout ends up lasting 3 seconds because that's all the parent can tolerate. Or other times it happens where a child's put in timeout and, you know, things on the stove, laundry's going off, somebody's at the door, somebody calls, and the child sits in timeout for 20 minutes because all these other things kind of intervened and got in the way. So the timer can be really helpful just to kind of track things and make sure that you're sticking to it, but also signaling you that you're in charge. And also, when the timer goes off, sometimes kids will learn that this is when I can pop up and get out of timeout. That's not the case. Timer goes off, they're still in timeout. Only time they get out of timeout is when they hear from mom, they hear from dad, they hear from aunt, they hear from teacher, they hear from grandma. Whomever put them in is the one that lets them out. This also can create situations between parents. Mom puts in, dad takes out, dad puts in, mom takes out. That sometimes happens with busy families, and I wouldn't beat yourself up about it. However, it's a whole lot more consistent a message for the child that the person puts me in is the person that takes me out. That mom's timeout looks, feels, smells, tastes just like dad's timeout. And so I know that this consequence is going to be consistent across the caregivers. Not always possible, but can be helpful. So this gets at kind of the questions y'all had about setting timeout up. Talking about it as much as possible, practicing. Make sure you practice before you go live. And even if you had negative timeout experiences in the past, tonight, if it's not too late, tomorrow, whenever you decide that we're changing things, we're doing things different, sitting down, talking about it, getting up in practice. Mom puts dad in timeout. child puts mom in timeout. Like we take turns in the different roles, so we have no question whatsoever. This is why you go, this is where you go, this is how long it lasts, and you don't have to do the full timeout, but just practicing that. And even when kids see parents putting each other in timeout or parents going to timeout, that gives you a chance to model it. And so they can see what a perfect timeout looks like and how to get out of timeout. Also, you can kind of troubleshoot or problem solve, making noise in timeout. And so the child can see, depending on age, again, that, mom's yelling and screaming when she's in timeout. She's going to stay in timeout longer. And then going live. And once you go live, you don't have to have any more conversations about this. So we're doing timeout. Child bites you. We don't have to talk about it. We already talked about this. So I bite you. I'm making a decision that I need a timeout right now. I need a kind of that corrective experience. This takes a lot of practice, especially if you've had negative experiences with timeout in the past. It takes a lot of practice to overcome what's already been learned. I don't know if any of y'all have biters out there, but biting can be a really, really insidious problem, and one I recommend timeout for, but one you need to be really consistent with. I have done a lot of observations in preschools and that kind of thing. When I've seen biting come up, it tends to happen, 4 to 5 times more than what's caught. And so the biting works a whole lot more frequently than they're getting the consequence for it. And so the repetition or the practice that they get is, with this behavior, getting me what I want it to get me. And so you want to make sure that they're having the repetition or the practice of, I do what I'm not supposed to do, I sit in timeout. And it takes some patience, because especially with negative experiences, you may have to do timeout for a couple of days, maybe even a couple of weeks before you start getting some traction in the right direction. Whenever I do these parenting U-Talks, it tends to be with really conscientious parents who do a lot of reading and pay attention to Mamaha and publications from their pediatrician or advice, those kinds of things. It's really easy to get down on yourself. What am I doing wrong? Why does this work for other parents and not for me? So you want to be really careful as you go through this, not to beat yourself up. That you get to make a lot of mistakes, you get to do it wrong most of the time, and until you find out what's right, that this is a really kind of experimental process to figure out what works for you, what works for your child, what works in your family, those sorts of things. And to keep in mind that you've got hundreds of thousands of interactions between now and when you're no longer taking care of your child. And so even if you screw up, 100,000 times, as long as you get it right, the other 500,000, you're doing pretty well. And so there's lots and lots of time to move things in the right direction. And you need to take care of yourself too. That you want to be careful about using any of these interventions. That if this is a really busy, stressful time for your family, that maybe you decide that we're going to hold off on timeout until things settle down. Because families go through lots of periods of demand and stress and all those kinds of things. And so maybe we put this off until we can really, really do it more intensely and calmly and effectively. And that's why it can be really important to have either a parenting partner or somebody you can look to help stay calm and grounded. Because going into these interactions and these using these behavior management kinds of techniques when you're super upset or super stressed out from work or whatever kind of the drive home or the day you had, and then all of a sudden there's flour all over the kitchen because they got into the cabinets, it's going to be really hard to keep your calm. And so having somebody you can tap and kind of tag team the situation can be really helpful, or someone you can call and say, I need my own time out, and make sure that you can be calm and kind of effective in your parenting. Yes?
You see, I walk into my kitchen and covered in flour. I am mad, but that child also needs the timeout right now.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes you got to suck it up. And that's why I love this sort of parenting you motto about advanced training for the hardest job of your life. Like sometimes It's going to be about sucking it up, that I'm really, really mad that there's flour all over the place. And if I'm parenting with this anger, then it's going to be much less effective. If I'm parenting in, at least in terms of talking about timeout, in this the most boring way possible, it's going to be a whole lot more effective, and will make it less likely in the future that there's going to be flour all over the place. So in those moments, it's also helpful to kind of keep your eyes on the prize, to make sure that this is about managing the behavior in front of me, not about whatever else is going on. Let's see, we talked a little bit about when to start getting out of timeout, or timeout resistance. One of the things that I recommend is, kind of depends on the situation. If you've got a runner that they keep getting out of timeout, out of timeout, out of timeout, either initially moving them back in, if they get out of timeout maybe for the second time, that you have a backup spot, that this is where they go for timeout instead, and that might be where you have to look at a room timeout. I don't tend to recommend a child's bedroom as a place to do timeout for a couple of different reasons. You want the bedroom to be a positive experience, and most kids' bedrooms are at least have some reinforcing things. Like this is where I got my toys, this is where I got my stuffed animals, this is where I got my puzzles or my games. And so if we're talking about timeout from positive reinforcement, you don't want to have any of those kind of reinforcing experiences available. 18 months is a great time to start having these kinds of conversations and planting the seed, but it's not too late if your child's 5 or 6 to start working this in and thinking about doing this in more effective ways. We talked about space. Putting self in timeout is kind of an interesting one. It makes me wonder if there are contrasts between the way your child gives themselves a timeout and the way we've talked about timeout in here, in terms of it not being reinforcing or talking about duration, those sorts of things, because you should get a reaction, and a child shouldn't like timeout. And so I would maybe look at the factors that make it less aversive or less enjoyable. Yes?
Is it okay to take toys away from him as a punishment
Sure.
versus timeout? Because timeout to him is just no big deal. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. In fact, if you could think about timeout as more broadly as timeout from positive reinforcement, and if the most reinforcing thing in the environment is this particular toy, it can go into timeout. The toy can go into timeout. Or whatever he's doing at the time that the misbehavior occurs, maybe that's lost. And so you can...
Something else, and then you took his favorite toy away. Although it had nothing to do with his favorite toy.
At that age, he should be able to make the connection.
Gotcha.
But you're right, like having it as immediate and relevant as possible is valuable. Though if you have to have like this sort of value-added consequence, maybe his, I don't know, Transformer goes out or his Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle goes on top of the fridge, whatever it is.
All right, thank you.
As far as, I'll be right up. As far as doing it in public, absolutely I recommend doing it in public. Wherever you go. I had an experience a couple weeks ago at the zoo. Like we were in the gorilla complex, and this same 3-year-old you heard earlier was sitting in timeout on a bench, and I looked away to, the gorilla was doing something interesting, and I looked back and she was surrounded by, I don't know, docents or zoo workers thinking that she was lost. And so it was unfortunate, because she's sitting there yelling and screaming because everybody's having a good time and she has to sit there. But it was really important because I think she'd taken a swing at one of her siblings or wandered off away from the group in kind of a dangerous way. And so I wanted to make sure that she had this timeout experience, and it was incredibly effective because there were all these really fun things going on. She has to sit on a bench. And so the zoo employees were very understanding when I told them that she wasn't lost, that she was just naughty and needed to sit there. But this also is overcoming some anxiety for parents too. That, I don't know if y'all have had this experience, but when I go to Walmart, I hear at least 8 tantrums, and probably 15 if I walk by the toy section while I'm there. And so you're in good company when you're actually doing a timeout in those spaces or places, that wherever you are, if a child starts to learn that I can get away with this when we're at Walmart or at the Children's Museum, then what they learn is, maybe this rule doesn't always apply. And that gets you in a really dangerous place, because then they have to test when they go to new places. Is this one of the ones where I can get away with this, or not one of the ones I can get away with this? If they know there's always a timeout waiting, if I'm not listening to mom, or there's always a timeout waiting if I, hit a sibling or hit dad, you're going to have much better behaved kids everywhere you go. Yes?
Is it okay to take them to a bathroom or something
Sure.
in public, just to try to remove them from as much stimulus as possible?
Mm-hmm. This is maybe not as relevant a recommendation given the season that we're going into, but also taking them out to the car and sitting in the car seat in the car with it not on is just fine, as long as you're standing right next to the car when it's happening. Because anywhere you use for timeout, you want to make sure the child's safe and that they're not doing anything dangerous or destructive, and so you want to monitor very closely wherever the timeout is happening. But yeah, the car's great, or the bathroom's great. A less popular corner of the store is just fine if you're wandering around and there's a better place to go. I know I was at Von Mar the other day, and there's a really nice ladies' lounge. It would make it unpleasant for maybe the other ladies in the lounge, but that could be a great place for a timeout. I think you had a question.
Yeah, I don't know if this is really specific, but obviously I've got a 4-month-old and I've got a 21-month-old, and she is a hitter, she's a runner. She doesn't sit still for timeouts. And that makes it really tough if I'm kind of doing something with him. How do and I knew you had multiple kids too. What do you do? I mean, what do you do? How many times do you keep putting them in a different place, putting them in, can I hold her? Can I put her in her high chair and strap her in? Really?
Yes.
Awesome.
It gets a little bit difficult in those situations to put her in a high chair, because you don't want the high chair to become associated with a consequence, and so then you get mealtime resistance. She doesn't want to get in the high chair because it's a consequence. But those kinds of situations where you can put her into a safe, confined space is just, and I'm not recommending closets or something like that, but a place where that she's safe, that you can see her. Some families will use a car seat inside, and I don't necessarily recommend that either. It doesn't have a strong seal of approval, because you don't want the car seat to be associated with a consequence, but something like that could work for a timeout. And especially if you've got other little ones running around, you need to find something that works and is convenient and can happen quickly. And so a high chair is not something I would discourage necessarily.
Until we get over the hump of the 45 minutes running and screaming.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And of course you want to monitor closely. You don't want to put her in there and they go clean the gutters or something. But you want to stay close. Did you have one too? Or are we just agreeing? Okay. Yes.
That's a quick one, because I wasn't here for the whole thing, but is there ever a time where timeout's it's just not going to work? It's right before bedtime. She's having a meltdown. She's just tired. It's just, that it's just going to get worse and worse if you just stop the behavior, let's go to bed, and then just call it. Or do you try and do, okay, now you get timeout because you did this, or I don't know.
There are definitely times where you want to call it. I think if you want to be super hardcore about it, then you go through the whole routine of timeout at that point. I don't recommend it because it's so disruptive for families, and if the child is already tired and dysregulated, they're less likely to learn effectively in those situations, and it's really more about sleep than it is about the misbehavior. And so there are times where we'll deal with this another time. But yeah, you're right that if it's 5 minutes past bedtime already, and you can also figure out another consequence in those situations, that we don't have timeout, but now we can't read a story, or now you don't get the thing that you sleep with, or something like that. That you figure out another consequence for it. Yes.
I would say with the twins, one of the biggest issues is that I use the timer, and we've done it successfully, and we do it with the toys, and we use timer for other things too. It's 5 minutes before bed, we set the timer, and they enjoy setting it, so it's kind of, they have an understanding. But Unfortunately, I also, they get along so incredibly well. They're their best friends and worst enemies. And ignoring is great, but I can't tell the other 2.5-year-old to ignore his brother if I'm trying to get other stuff done and actively ignore the other one. He'll come over and pat his back and try to bring him a toy or scold him.
Okay. In those situations, I tend to recommend when you're introducing timeout or having a conversation about expectations, there is like a sibling timeout protocol that when one person in the family is in timeout, everybody else has very specific other things that they're supposed to be doing. And so maybe Dora goes on the TV. So he's into timeout, we turn on Dora so in another room. Or that's when we get out this really fun toy that you don't get to play with very often. Right? And it also sets up a really sharp contrast for the one in timeout, that I see or hear time in going on somewhere else. And so this, based on what you said earlier, I'm guessing it's the runner, the one who's having trouble with timeout, is not the one going over and consoling the other twin.
Well, I mean, they will both be, like I said, I have one who's the timeout works really well for, and he has you get that point across and it feels good, like, yeah, we got it. And it will work occasionally for the other one, but he also tries to mimic and step into that role. I see it when they're play acting with their dolls and things. He'll put things in timeout, but he'll scold the other one. He'll go over and scold it, and so we'll even, there's the sympathy, but then it's, you're not the parent, it's not your job. So it comes and goes, and they can kind of flip-flop different roles, but the primary, the hitter, he's also my peacemaker. Does that sound weird? Like, if the other one's
2.5, they're still figuring things out.
he'll do whatever to make his brother happy, even if it's after he smacks him across the face. So, I mean, they're just learning the different things, but, so they'll kind of flip-flop. It's not always a consistent. But that one particular one, the inconsistency is so hard with him because he is very socially intelligent.
Mm-hmm. Well, and this is a broader point for every parent here and everywhere else, that development isn't a linear process, that there'll be jumps, and then there'll be really slow things that come online, and there'll be like lots of regression, and you think that you've really got something, and then all of a sudden, they're wetting the bed again. And so I guess in that situation, the inconsistency isn't surprising and shouldn't undermine your implementation. Like, keep going, keep trying, and when they see that you're going to be consistent with this, their response should increasingly get consistent to the timeout. And this is true for any family with siblings, having something the other sibling does very specifically when timeout happens. That occupies them, but then also sets up that contrast for the child that's in timeout.
Older and she's more able to verbalize. So like once I briefly tell her, okay, you're in timeout because you were hitting or whatever, and she's timeout's over and I go to take her out, do you briefly say, do you know why I put you in timeout, and then say I love you and set them on the way?
It's really, really hard for a parent to see their child in timeout and experience that distress and not do what you just described. Not have some like reunion where I sweep you up and we're back together and everything is fine, right? When it comes to using this intervention, the I love you, we're back together is not something that I would advise. Just because we want timeout to be super boring and your experience of this consequence is your responsibility. And one of the other nice kind of side effects of timeout is it teaches kids self-regulation, that I'm in this lousy situation because of what I did, and I'm really upset about it, and the only way I get out is if I calm down. And so I've got to figure out a way to not be so upset. As far as asking questions when the kids come out of timeout, do you know why you went into timeout? Do you understand this? Absolutely not. because that sort of hands the power right back to the child. And they can say, well, no, I don't know. What was it? Or make something up. And then you're in this whole long conversation about what happened or what didn't happen. When you're doing this timeout, not only is it boring, but you're in charge. And so you're in timeout because you didn't follow directions. Timeout happens, and at the end of timeout, you were in timeout because you weren't following directions. Timeout's over. On your way.
We have a Twitter question that goes along with that. They want to know, do you ask the child to apologize once they come out of timeout for the behavior?
The question was about apologizing for timeout apologizing for the behavior when they come out of timeout. It depends. The sort of general response I would have is it depends on your family if you want to take that on after the timeout. I don't tend to recommend it because then it gets you into another compliance situation. You told the child to do something and now they have to go do it. And so they might not apologize. They might create the situation where you have to keep cajoling them and arguing with them and pushing them to go do the apology, and then they don't do the apology, and then you have to have a consequence for that. And it becomes this like long drawn out thing because you want them to apologize. That doesn't tend to be effective. And just like asking them, do you understand why you were in timeout, putting the demand on them to apologize after the fact is giving them power in the situation that you don't necessarily want them to have. And at the age range that we're talking about, their empathy skills or remorse are very, very underdeveloped. And so any apology you're getting out of them is unlikely to be very heartfelt. And so it just becomes a compliance situation, right? Like I'm saying the words that mom and dad want me to say. And it's good to teach that. And you might want to teach that lesson in less heated, consequence-laden situations. So teaching about apologizing for behavior, it might be like when they bump into someone or knock something over, that there's less kind of conflict around it. Yes?
Also a question from our Mamaha chat. The mom, her son is 6, and so she's wondering if he's getting too big for timeout. As a effective discipline for him, he gets it, he goes in, it's boring, he comes out, but his poor behavior, the behavior that led to him being in timeout, is not necessarily changing. It is still happening. So, should she continue with it, or should she try something new?
Excuse me. So the question was about a 6-year-old, and it sounds like the benefits of timeout seem to be losing their effectiveness, or the benefits aren't there as much anymore. I'm sorry to give so many slippery psychologist answers, but it depends on the situation. If your 6-year-old is getting to a place where they can understand the loss of privileges or other consequences are more effective, and you see them being more effective, and so they're losing time with friends, or they're losing the iPad for the night, or they're losing their favorite toy, then that can be more effective than the timeout. You can also kind of look at the timeout factors that are part of the situation. So you might think about extending the timeout, because for some kids 6 minutes of quiet is super difficult and they couldn't possibly sit for 6 minutes straight. But you might have a child that is really self-regulated and 6 minutes isn't so bad, and so you might look at 8 minutes or 9 minutes, extending it a little bit longer, or looking at another kind of consequence. At 6 years old, there might be chores that they have to do, and so you can add on extra kind of demands in those situations. But yeah, there are lots of things that you can do, either to make the timeout more effective or look at a consequence that might be more effective. Yes?
If anybody has a daughter, Lucy C.
That's us.
Okay, she just needs her diaper changed.
Oh.
Yes?
When we put our child into a timeout, go on there sitting, but then eventually kind of gets real comfortable, lays down on the floor. Do you let them lay on the floor, or do you prop them back up, or is there a proper position that they should go through timeout?
Not necessarily. I think I've worked with kids who fall asleep really easily, and they fall asleep in timeout, and that actually led to longer conversations about is the child getting enough sleep. But But in that situation, you don't necessarily, I mean, it's not like a torture tactic. And so we don't have to have the child like in a really uncomfortable position for this to happen. I've had some parents who really like to have the child doing wall squats when they're in timeout, which isn't necessarily something I would recommend either. But I mean, the whole point is nothing enjoyable is occurring. And so if the child really likes to lie down, maybe you have a timeout chair. But if they lie down and they're still bored or it's not enjoyable in any kind of way, they don't have any toys, they don't have any entertainment, they're not getting any attention, then lying down isn't necessarily a problem at all, as long as it's in the space that you have identified for timeout. Because I'll get kids who like scoot all the way across the floor or roll down the hallway. All of that, you put them right back into timeout and the timer starts over.
Back on that, my son can entertain himself in a white room. Just no matter where he is, if he's naked, clothed, if there's nothing around him, he can be entertained. So he plays with stuff or makes up games while he's sitting in timeout.
Mm-hmm.
Is that acceptable?
It can be, as long, I mean, we can't take away his fingers, and we can't take away, his eyes if he's like looking around and entertaining himself that way. That, however, I bet is not as much fun as all of the other positive reinforcing things that he could be engaged in. And so you can still really set up the contrast. And especially, I think you talked earlier about having siblings running around, that if the family timeout protocol is everybody does something super fun because one person is in timeout, that might sharpen the contrast for you. And so, yes, playing with my hands is fun, but not as much fun as what everybody else is doing. Yes?
Is there a proper distance that the parent has to be away from the child to establish solitary?
Not necessarily at all, because even we talked about 18 months and 2 years old, they might need you standing right there to hold them in timeout. So even if you have physical contact, that's just fine. I remember when the kids were younger, she was a year, and she would get about a 5-second timeout, but she was sitting on, like, she would hit or throw something that, all right, you threw something, now you have a timeout, she'd have to sit, and I mean, at 1, you got to hold. And so just very gently holding her on the shoulders, and she hated it and stopped hitting. Everyone feel like the questions are answered? Ready to go home and try it? See how it works? I think I put in, there's contact information here, and so if you try it doesn't work, give me a call. If you feel like you've done everything I've said and you've tried it long and hard and effectively and it hasn't gotten you anywhere, there might be something else going on. And if you want to give me a call, we can talk about that too. Because sometimes, I mean, kids with ADHD need effective timeouts as well, but there are some indicators of ADHD when you're going through the course of timeout. And so there can be other things going on that may need a broader scope of intervention. Did you have a question?
We have a 2-year-old that is very defiant, and he likes to hit. And so one of the questions that I had that you answered in restraining, but if he is, while you're restraining him, is trying to hit you, then do you hold his arms down and continue to sit in timeout until he is calm?
With a short answer, yes. With the caveat, you don't want to restrain him in any kind of way that could do any damage. Right. And so in those situations, especially with a 2-year-old, even a real gentle hold on kind of shoulders or upper arms would be enough to keep them in the space that you designated as a timeout. And if they're hitting you, the timeout hasn't started yet. Right? And so you don't
Right.
start the timer.
Okay.
And especially at that age, they're probably not going to do a lot of damage
No.
to you. And so,
He does hit pretty hard though sometimes.
I bet, yeah, they can, absolutely. And so, in those situations, that you want to just make sure that you're safe, and I think you said he is safe.
Yeah.
So,
Hold.
yep.
Okay.
I absolutely don't recommend getting on top of the child, like bear hugging, any of those kinds of things, because it's really easy to restrict airflow and little lungs and those kinds of things. So you don't want to do anything like that. Did you have one more?
Of course. Is timeout an effective discipline technique for tantrums?
It can be.
Okay. Both of mine throw tantrums over everything.
Mm-hmm. It absolutely can be. I think, especially if you've done like planned ignoring and not giving any attention to the tantrum behavior and it still persists, then a timeout can be really especially effective for tantrums because it requires a little bit of self-regulation to get out of the timeout. And also there's some interesting research on the science of tantrums, and that when kids have tantrums, any kind of sensory input that they get can spike the tantrum right back up. And so there's this arc that tantrums tend to go through, that angry, and it peaks, and then it's kind of sad and weepy and not necessarily remorseful, but just it's kind of softer and sadder. If during that soft, sad time, parents are like, well, you never should have gotten upset about this, or you're still not getting your toy, it gets right back up. And so what a timeout does is it allows the time and space to go through the whole kind of timeout arc, and so that they're kind of quiet and calm and ready to come out of it. So yeah, timeout can be really effective for tantrums. All right. Well, I think they've been very generous to let us stay later. So thank you all for coming out. And if you have questions, please give me a call. Yeah, absolutely.